What I'm fighting for is simple, and it's to put treatment at the heart and the center of the city's agenda, policy agenda. We can't keep deferring investments in treatment while watching the same people cycle through homelessness, overdose, emergency rooms, and jail over and over and over again.
That's Seattle City Council President Sarah Nelson explaining a new proposal she has to use a state-approved boost to city sales tax collection to fund a new treatment and public safety program. How's this going to work, and what might you be paying for it? Plus, let's keep talking taxes, because two local leaders from different sides of the political spectrum are teaming up on another tax measure dealing with business and occupation tax, which the council is getting more information about this week. And what's the best way to help people who are homeless living on federal lands? A Seattle area congresswoman is raising that issue as well as we dive into the start of July with Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I am a host on the Seattle channel. The views expressed here are mine, and I am joined with my friend and co-host this week, yet again, David Croman, City Hall reporter for the Seattle Times. Good to be back with you, David, and we are on the brink of having Mariners catcher Cal Raleigh get named the starter for the All-Star team. That would be the first for the M's, a catcher there. And like you, I love seeing that he's also doing the home run derby, and his dad is going to pitch to him. I thought about it. I was a little worried that if it were my dad, he would probably plug me with a few pitches if I had him in there and then tell me to rub some dirt on it and take a lap. But I'm guessing the Raleighs will probably have a much better showing out there.
Yeah, isn't his dad a college baseball coach? So I imagine
there's your big difference right there.
I imagine he's thrown quite a bit of BP, but it's a very sweet thing. I imagine would be a big thing for all of them.
Oh, totally. And Adley Rutschman did that last year. I thought that was a really cool thing. Right. So way to go, catchers. Have those dads pitch to you. I love it. Well, thank you, David. Thanks to everybody out there, including awesome patrons like Bobby, who just came on board to support the show. If you want to be cool like your sister Bobby, become a patron. A pledge of just $5 a month is where things start. You get access to patrons' first content, like the episode we had last week on educational issues with Dr. Stefan Blanford. You also get yourself a very cool Seattle News, Views, and Brews decal. So check it out, Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. Also, you can find this podcast on Converge Media. The video version is on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, let's get this party rolling. Time for Right Here, Right Now. So at a press conference on Tuesday morning, Council President Sarah Nelson laid out the bones of a resolution to dedicate up to 25% of any proposed sales tax increase for what she calls a progressive public safety initiative that invests in addiction treatment services. So the state just authorized cities to increase local sales taxes by 0.1% earlier this year to go towards specifically public safety programs. And Nelson says her goal is to put treatment at the center of the city's agenda, filling gaps in existing services to support the city's progress on public safety. So, David, I was doing some quick math here. It's estimated this tax hike, if the council wants it, goes through with it, would add about $35 million to the city's coffers. And so 25% of that, $8.75 million, if I'm doing the math right, getting close to $9 million there. And Council President Nelson was listing a lot of possibilities for this money: on-demand treatment, diversion services, etc. So my question is, what impact is a bit less than $9 million going to make? And where's this money going to actually go? What do you think of this?
It's not going to be a global solution by any stretch. Yeah, I think it's probably first worth backing up and saying that the mayor hasn't proposed using this tax yet, which he probably will do because it's kind of free money at a time when there's a budget deficit. But, I've asked the mayor about it, and they're non-committal about whether or not they would actually take advantage of this tax. I mean, it is a sales tax, and they're conscious of the fact that sales taxes are aggressive. But assuming he does propose it, then globally, of course, it's not going to necessarily be a sea change in the fentanyl epidemic. But there are some fairly interesting and targeted places you could spend this money. We've talked about it before, but the pilot program to basically pay for people to go to private treatment instead of Medicaid treatment, that has, it's a simple way to go about it. Privately funded treatment is usually open. There's usually spots there, which is much, much different than Medicaid treatment. And, that's always been a big thing is somebody says, I'm ready to go through treatment, but Medicaid, it's like a 3-month wait list. Right. And then something changes. So, I think expanding a pilot program that already exists in Seattle to get people into private treatment could be one way to do it.
Yeah, Council President Nelson mentioned that too. Keep going.
Yeah, the other would be, expanding access to Sublocade. I don't know what the emphasis is, but it's basically injectable form of buprenorphine, which can last, I think, like a month or something like that. And that's a pretty big deal for folks who might not always be in one place at a time. So,
Yeah.
would this money end the fentanyl epidemic? No, I don't think anyone's making that argument, but it's a new area for Seattle that
Yeah.
has mostly been county and state led. And so, I think there are a few areas where, at least for a select number of people, it could make a significant difference.
In terms of where this money could go, it's supposed to go towards public safety measures. Does putting this percentage of it potentially, again, if the council goes through with it, if the mayor's into it, et cetera, does putting a certain percentage of it towards treatment, is that going to work? I just think of the other competing public safety interests of the city, including making sure they're paying for these new officers that are coming on, which are costing a lot of dollars here. Is there going to be a conflict there? How do you see that coming to a head?
I think possibly, yeah. The data coming out of their hiring numbers seems to be pretty legitimate. It appears that they are, in fact, hiring more officers than they have in recent years. And so that's going to cost more money. And in previous years, they've actually underspent their budget. There seems to suggest that they will probably overspend their budget this year. So the question is, are they going to be $35 million over budget? Probably not.
Yeah.
I think there's a potential for some competition here. Both state legislators and city politicians talk about how public safety isn't just about cops on the street. It's a combination of all things. And I think it would be hard for the mayor to come and, oppose a resolution like this, talking about spending more money on treatment.
Last piece on this, I was looking at something that Ryan Packer wrote in The Urbanist about this. So this would be a 0.1% sales tax increase on top of a 0.1% public safety sales tax increase and a 0.1% transportation benefit district sales tax that the King County Council is also planning to put in place here. So the sales tax rate here in Seattle would be going higher, possibly up to 10.65%, if I'm doing my math right, with the city and county add-ons thrown in there, reaffirming it as one of the highest sales tax rates in the country. I just wonder if the critics who are accurately pointing out that the sales tax can be regressive here, is that going to be part of the pushback on this plan, or do you see that taking root at all?
For sure. And I suppose that's why, Mayor Harrell was asked about this at a press conference last week. Are you gonna do this proposal? And he hemmed and hawed a bit because of that. I think what happens is each 0.1% sales tax bump feels small. This is like a really important thing. We all care
maybe
about treatment.
$30 a year for your average taxpayer there, making about $75,000 a year.
Yeah, so it's just each individual little bump feels pretty small, and so it's easily justified, and most people in the Seattle area end up supporting it.
Yeah.
You hear that enough times, and then you look back on 10 years, and you're at a 10.5% sales tax rate, which is, like you said, pretty aggressive. And sales tax is widely viewed as, rightfully, as the most regressive way to tax people because everyone pays the same rate. I think at a certain point, it does get tough to swallow. The answer Council President Nelson said is, it was the Black Caucus in the legislature that pushed for this sales taxing authority, and it is the Black community who's most disproportionately affected by public safety issues in the city and addiction and in need of treatment, disproportionately represented by Black individuals. And so she's saying, this is coming from the community who would benefit from it the most, and so therefore I feel justified in proposing this.
Yeah, I'm very interested to see where this goes. And we're talking more about taxes on the program in just a little bit, but I did want to mention there's plenty of other activity on the city docket this week. The council finally approving Sean Barnes as Seattle Police Chief, which we've talked about on the show. The mayor signing the legislation to speed up Link light rail permitting and construction, a few of the highlights there. But one you might not be tracking is in the Land Use Committee on Wednesday. Councilmember Alexis Mercedes Rink sponsoring the Roots to Roofs program, an affordable housing measure that looks a heck of a lot like the Connected Communities measure former Councilmember Morales sponsored last year. So this is a pilot that would allow up to 35 projects across the city to take advantage of additional density allowances. They can build higher there as long as they set aside at least 25% of planned housing units as affordable for lower income households for up to 50 years. Plus, there are additional density bonuses on parcels that previously were under racially restrictive covenants, which are now illegal. David, what do you make of this reboot? I feel like there might be something a little different here in that there's a co-sponsor in Councilmember Mark Solomon, which is a bit of a leg up on what former Councilmember Morales had going with her proposal.
Yeah, and I would say, too, maybe the fact that it's coming at around the same time as they're going to be considering the comprehensive plan in earnest makes a difference. That's one interpretation, too, because that was a criticism of Councilmember Morales, is why are you doing this now ahead of when we've actually had any time to discuss the long-term comprehensive plan? The more cynical view is that Councilmember Nelson was not particularly liked by her colleagues.
Councilmember Morales, keep going.
Or sorry, excuse me, Councilmember Morales. That was one of the arguments she made when she was resigning was, hey, I had this proposal with a lot of backing and all of you shot it down for reasons I couldn't fully understand.
Yeah.
Whereas, Councilmember Rink, of course, she's politically not always in line with a lot of the council, but does seem to be a little more adept at kind of politicking within City Hall, as we saw, with this B&O tax proposal we'll talk about a little more. And so, it is interesting. I think having Mark Solomon sign on to is helpful. We'll see. I think there's another criticism from the other side, which is, hey, you're making the argument this is good for these organizations and good for these particular areas to offer this additional height. If it's good for them, why not do this across the city for everybody?
Yep.
If it's good for them, why not everybody else? And I think that is, kind of goes into a larger discussion about using zoning incentives as leverage, which is a very common tactic in City Hall. The underlying implication under all of them is that this is beneficial in some ways to allow for more development. And so if you are making that case, why are you not making that case more broadly?
Yeah, and it looks like this measure, if indeed it does go through, could actually be in place before the comprehensive plan measure that the council's working on goes in place. So yeah, there's a lot in effect here. But just real quick on the kind of the voting dynamic going on here. More good reporting from Ryan Packer in The Urbanist on this issue, pointing out this legislation would likely come to a full council vote after the departure of Councilmember Kathy Moore. Her last day, July 7th. She'll be replaced at the end of the month. Councilmember Moore, former Councilmember Wu, and Councilmember Rivera were the pushback voices on that Morales measure last year. And Rivera will be the only one of those left on the council by the time this most likely comes up for a vote. How do you see that voting dynamic on this issue here, if indeed this does go through to the full council, which I'm thinking it might with the co-sponsor there?
Yeah, it's a good point that Ryan makes, because Councilmember Moore is by far the most vocal density skeptic and upzoning skeptic. While this council is certainly not likely to appoint a left-wing progressive to replace Kathy Moore, the majority of this council is more open to density and construction than Kathy Moore is. And so while perhaps you won't get a left-wing firebrand replacing Kathy Moore, you might get somebody who is more okay with added density and height, and that would certainly change the dynamics on a vote like this.
Yeah, really interested to see what happens there, and interested to see who the council picks as that process goes forward over the next couple of weeks here. All right, well, coming up, another proposal from Councilmember Rink with her new best friend on the 7th floor of City Hall, Mayor Bruce Harrell. We're breaking down the details about a new business tax plan and who might be pushing back against it. That's next on Now Hear This. Well, just when you thought the political pool party couldn't get any stranger this summer, here comes Mayor Bruce Harrell and Councilmember Alexis Mercedes Rink teaming up on a plan to restructure how Seattle taxes its local businesses. The council's Finance Committee is looking at this in its meeting this week. Harrell, more of a moderate, as we know, is joining forces with Rink, who ran on the platform of progressive revenue to lessen taxes on smaller businesses while raising rates on the top 10% of the highest revenue businesses. With the city facing a $240 million budget shortfall this year and more possible cuts in federal dollars, as Councilmember Rink sees it, this is a measure worth considering.
The $90 million generated annually will protect services that keep families fed, housed, and safe. As the Trump regime cuts federal funding for food banks, emergency shelter, and housing programs, local investment becomes the difference between maintaining these lifelines and watching them disappear.
So the council would have to approve this measure before it would go before the voters in November. But first things first here, David, what do you make of this political alliance of Rink and Harrell, both up for re-election, I should mention? What do you make of it?
Yeah, it's quite interesting. If you ask Harrell's people, they kind of give you the mayor's willing to work with anybody. And there's a few ways to look at it. Some one maybe a little more conspiratorial, but I'll get to that in a second, which is, the first one is it was Councilmember Rink who brought this to Mayor Harrell, which makes sense that she would be the one to kind of bring up this idea. I think she's politically smart enough to know that she doesn't have the political power to pass this alone, and so convincing the mayor to go along with her is about as good as she could do, short of maybe getting Council President Nelson on board, which I'm know if she will be. And, for Harrell, it solves a bit of a problem, which is the budget. They are saying they have done everything they can to avoid deep cuts, and without new revenue, they would have to do that this year. I think there's still going to be cuts nevertheless. It also kind of offers this narrative that is a little different than what we've seen in other kind of quote progressive revenue conversations around, because it includes these cuts to taxes for most businesses. 90% they estimate will see lower rates, and 3/4 will pay no B&O tax at all. And so it's got this kind of pro small business approach. Of course, the problem is we are talking about gross receipts, which is always the problem in these contexts, because gross receipts are not income, not profit. And so that means that grocery stores and restaurants are both industries with super high expenses and really slim margins are going to have a hard time with this. And, that was really the fatal flaw of the 2018 head tax debate, is once you had, say, a Wajimaya showing up to City Hall and testifying against it, it becomes politically more difficult to do. And so in Seattle, it is good politics to say you're taxing the rich and the corporate. We saw that with the social housing vote. Bruce Harrell knows that. I think Alexis Mercedes Rink knows that. The problem is it's not as clean on something like this, because it isn't just super wealthy corporations. It's, like I said, local grocery stores, which are already kind of having a hard time in Seattle. PCC is going to pay a higher rate because if this passes. So, it's an interesting dynamic that kind of scratches the progressive revenue itch while giving Harrell a decent narrative here, but is going to be a politically tough fight.
Yeah, for sure. There's ever so slightly a little bit of an echo of when former Councilmember Sawant was running and was really all about the $15 minimum wage. And then Mayor-elect Ed Murray was on his way to becoming elected and co-opted it into his campaign. It's interesting to me to see how a council and a mayor that I think what came in over this past year, very much on the moderate side, are starting to swing a little bit more towards that progressive side. I think you could make that argument with this. You could make that argument potentially with that treatment option that Council President Nelson is talking about. Do you see that larger political move at work here, David?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think on the revenue side, yes, I do see that, because this was a council that talked big about auditing the budget, and finding efficiencies, and there have been some cuts, but it was pretty clear early on that they weren't going to find the level of cuts that they would need to actually close this deficit. And so in that respect, there was a certain reality that set in that actually trimming the budget to the point of closing the deficit would be pretty dramatic and not politically popular. And so it became more politically expedient to talk about new revenue. We saw Councilmember Rob Sacco was at this press conference, which suggests he's on board with this proposal. So, on that respect, yes. On the treatment stuff, I don't know. Council President Nelson has been pretty vocal about wanting more treatment options for a while, so I'm not sure that's necessary.
All right. But I guess I was trying to stretch the blanket a little too far there, but I definitely am seeing some different ideas from the council when it comes to revenue, I guess, is the through line I'm seeing there, because like you say, they've got to do something here. This forecast when it comes to the economy is relatively dismal, and $240 million, you're not going to be able to get that with cuts. I mean, that's the bottom line I'm seeing here.
Yeah, I mean, you could get it with cuts, but it would be cuts that people would feel in a real way. It would mean short library hours, community centers closing, fewer street sweepers, slower response times and power outages. I think they have canceled all of the consultant contracts that they can cancel.
That's right.
At this point, which is always their first step, is to, and I think they've probably stopped going to conferences and, stuff like that are cuts, but people don't feel. I think to get to $240 million, you start talking about slowing down certain city services that people would feel in a real way. And there might be an argument that that's the price to pay, but it's not a politically popular one in City Hall.
Yeah. Fair point there. There's a national issue I wanted to touch on with you here, David. A proposal from U.S. Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, repping the 7th District, which covers most of Seattle. She's introduced a bill called Housing Not Handcuffs. This would prohibit federal agencies from removing homeless people on federal land if they have nowhere else to go. The timing of this, very close to the anniversary of the Grants Pass versus Johnson decision from the U.S. Supreme Court, which allowed cities and states the ability to make living outside illegal, which has definitely happened in the state of Washington in places like Auburn and Burien. And David, I don't know if this is going to go anywhere in a Republican-dominated Congress, but I just thought it was a very novel approach to this issue. What do you make of this?
Yeah, I don't think it's going to go anywhere. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of talk these days about selling off federal
Right.
lands.
That's kind of why I would had it in my mind too. And where did this land go? And this so-called big beautiful bill, et cetera. Keep going.
Yeah, and I don't know how many people live on federal
Yeah.
lands. It's all pretty new to me.
Yeah.
I think it's a good bill for Mila Jayapal
Right.
because it kind of there's her progressive credentials, I suppose.
Yeah.
But it's hard for me to take it too seriously because it isn't going to go anywhere.
Yeah. Yeah. I know what you mean. It's interesting because when the Supreme Court made its decision last year on this, in this Grants Pass case, they said it's not cruel and unusual to punish people sleeping outdoors, even if there was no other alternative provided. So even if some sort of miracle happened and this bill from Jayapal was to pass, I just don't think it would withstand a court challenge either. But I guess what I'm seeing here is she is trying to raise more public awareness about what is happening with the homeless crisis across the country and trying to bring it up to a federal level because certainly I think we've seen it from the Trump administration. They're talking about clearing out a lot of public lands. They're talking about clearing out a lot of people who are homeless. And this is her attempt to try to push back on that, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. And I do think serious conversations around what to do about homelessness are lacking at the federal level.
Yeah.
There are blunt, sweeping conversations happening, but not nuanced ones about what would actually make a difference. And so, if this brings that conversation to the federal level, sure.
Right.
Again, it's just so out of the realm of possibility of what anyone, in a trifecta administration. But, maybe you get it out there and then sort of like what happens in the Washington legislature, you get a bill on the record and then keep introducing it until you have the politics for it and it passes.
Yeah. That might be the way we see something here. It's really striking to me to see how the big, beautiful bill that Congress is working on here puts so much of the responsibility back to states when it comes to services like helping people who are homeless or helping people with medical needs for that matter. So interested to see what happens there. But yeah, I don't think it's going anywhere, but something that Congresswoman Jayapal is pushing there for the 7th District. All right, coming up next, the end of an era and the start of something new at Seattle's Memorial Stadium in the shadow of the Space Needle. What's getting torn down? What's going in? We're discussing that coming up on What's Next. Well, in case you missed it, there was a farewell ceremony late last week for Seattle's 77-year-old Memorial Stadium, site of the city's first TV broadcast of a high school football game in 1947, also a hosting area for the World's Fair in 1962. In its place, there will be a modern facility, a 6,500-seat stadium that preserves the memorial wall honoring local high school students who died in World War II. Everything else will be demolished. A $140 million project here, David, paid for with private funding plus money from the city and school district. And voters approved this plan back in 2022. And it's been through a few delays here, but it looks like this project will be coming through. It won't be done, though, until 2027. So after the World Cup comes to town next year. David, a fond farewell to Memorial Stadium. How do you look at this project?
Yeah, I have some nostalgia around Memorial Stadium,
Me too.
mostly from going to Bumbershoot when I was a kid. It was kind of the first thing I was allowed to do alone with my friends was take the ferry and walk up to Seattle Center and go to Bumbershoot in middle school or whatever, and seeing some pretty big acts on that floor. At the same time, it's not nice.
Yeah, I know. I was going to say,
not a nice place.
It's so run down in there. I've been a number of times for my daughter doing different marching band stuff a few years ago in high school, and it just amazed me how run down it felt. And this is a place, Bob Dylan's played there, Pearl Jam's played there, Grateful Dead played its last show in Seattle there in 95, and it's like, man, this place is so run down. You've got this old World War II, barbed wire up on the fences outside. I don't know. That always shocked me that nothing had been done here over the many decades of this stadium.
No, and it's ungodly hot from my memory. Just the concrete floor basically reflecting back. And that corner of Seattle Center, I was sort of in tune to these conversations because they often included the PBS building where I used to work when I was crosscut.
Yeah.
But that whole corner is just it's kind of a dead zone for Seattle Center. It's like you've got this big, beautiful park in Seattle Center, and then one corner of it is just you've got this barrier of entry between the PBS building, the Memorial Stadium, and the big parking lot there. And before all of Ed Murray's stuff happened and derailed everything, that was like a big priority of his administration.
I
What do
remember
we
that.
do about this corner? They wanted to, that's why Crosscut PBS actually is not in that building anymore, because the city didn't want to renew the lease on that building because they wanted to redevelop it into something and turn that whole corridor into some kind of inviting entryway
Okay.
into the Seattle center.
Okay.
And the Memorial Stadium redevelopment was a big part of that. I don't know what the plans are with the parking lot or the PBS building anymore, but I do think that you've got the new climate pledge there.
Yeah.
It's a much more active place. You can go see Kraken games and things like that. And I think it's logical that this is the next step in updating Seattle Center, because it is a beautiful place, and I think it's kind of underappreciated in Seattle. Agreed.
And it's a place with a lot of history too. I think that's a cool part. Very glad that they're keeping that memorial wall around, and the new plan does look very cool, but it has been a time coming. I know there was some talk at least a couple of years ago where it's like, hey, we're going to have this ready to go by the World Cup, but that did not happen. It sounded like there were a few I's to dot and T's to cross here. And do you remember that conversation from a few years ago?
Yeah, vaguely. Yeah, although it seems like everything was, we're going to get it done before.
Right. Everyone's going to get lollipops and everything. Well, we'll see what pans out there. The plans look great. Again, it's supposed to be done in 2027, the remodeled Memorial Stadium. So looking forward to seeing that. But David, it is time to wrap up here. I saw an interesting note you posted on social media the other day, an observation about the fact that in many East Coast major cities, and you could probably make an argument about Chicago as well, their mayors are elected and reelected for multiple terms fairly often. Sometimes they serve for decades, as opposed to the recent spate of one-and-done mayors here in Seattle. Granted, we have some special circumstances with Mayor Murray and Mayor Durkin before Mayor Harrell. But what do you make of that? Is Seattle incapable of reelecting a mayor? What's going on?
Yeah, lately, I think it's maybe a symptom of growth or something. It's going to be uncomfortable, and City Hall just hasn't quite kept up. I don't know. I mean, like you said, you can kind of look at individual circumstances, but I think it's noteworthy that Nichols, McGinn, Murray had his things.
Nichols
Durkin
had 2 terms, but yeah. Mm-hmm.
He had, but he lost as
on
an
that
incumbent.
third one. Yep.
And it's not like he decided not to run. Like, the voters actually kicked him out.
Yes.
I think it fits into the theme of voters' dissatisfaction with leadership. I don't know. I couldn't tell you what's behind it. And whereas contrast, I remember being in New England and working in New England when I think it was, I can't remember his name, Menino, the Boston mayor.
Oh, okay.
There's a guy there who'd been there for 20 years, and it was like everybody talked about him like their old buddy. No one around here talks about the mayor in such positive terms as what I heard when I was over there. So I don't know what it is.
The guy that I met actually in Providence, Rhode Island, my sister went to Rhode Island School of Design, was Buddy Cianci. May he rest in peace. Here was a guy who served for decades, then went to jail for some sort of grifting, terrible thing, made his own pasta sauce that he sold and marketed while he was in jail, and then got reelected on the other end of his term. It's like,
very Rhode Island.
What is happening? Yeah, it was a very, very Providence thing. But rest in peace, buddy. That's some interesting stuff. We'll see what happens here in Seattle. Again, Mayor Harrell going for a second term here. He's burnishing his credentials with a few different people over the last couple of weeks here with some of the work he's been doing. But we're just about a month away from that primary, so we will have to see. David, thank you so much for joining me. Thanks to everybody who is listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. Thanks again to patrons who support the show. Bobby, you're number one. Really appreciate it. Thanks for jumping in. That special Patrons First podcast was for you. If you want to be a patron, please consider a pledge of $5 a month or more on Patreon to be a patron. Listen on Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen, we are there for you. Thanks also for watching on Converge Media. See you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2025.